Hello, today we are talking about there's something wrong with Aunt Diane and the ethics of tragedy online and in social media. Um, Hi, this is my first YouTube video. I am Amanda. I love the internet. I've been programming for a bit, designing for a bit. I am Gen Z, so I was like growing up with the internet. And so I really enjoy learning about technology, but also in my line of work, that means like learning about how it can be used against people or learning about like the ways that it's causing issues or causing other pain in our world. So right now I'm a startup CTO for a natural disaster company. I also run my own tech nonprofit. And so I'm on the internet like every day. I grew up on social media. I've been on social media for a decade. I have no brain cells. And so there's just so many different things about the internet that I've noticed, like good things, bad things, and a lot of this stuff I don't really get to talk about in my day-to-day line of work. So I really just wanted to like create a place for me to do these like sit down rambles of just like what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking about, what's occupying my brain, and just like connecting all of these dots. And so I'm going to be thinking about a lot of like hard questions and hard issues, and I don't have the answers, but I feel like I just want to discuss the problems and figure it out together. And I also just want to like unabashedly ramble. Like, I used to be a public speaker. I stopped because I didn't like being in public. So I'm trying to figure out a way for me to like use my voice and to talk about stuff I care about in a setting that I like feel comfortable in. So first and foremost, just like trigger warnings, we are going to be talking about a lot of tragedy, a lot of deaths, some school shooting stuff, accidents, and just like not safe for life stuff. So if you're feeling like you don't want to deal with all that, it's okay. It's all good. So I want to talk about the accident and then the HBO documentary, There's Something Wrong with Aunt Diane, and how I kind of feel like it was a really good microcosm of like how tragedy and grief and like all of these different things are on the internet. So the stuff that I'm really interested in is like, when is tragedy newsworthy? When does it kind of shift from like, here is this local accident to like, here is something that's online and it's okay for everybody to comment on? Um, Also, like, why we seek out tragedy, why we like true crime content, what and like what that means, right? Like, what does it mean when we make public content off of other people's private grief? So let's kind of start with the 2009 tectonic crash. So basically, it was this really big news story at the time where this mother who was like a executive and she ran like a billing and collections department, like she basically left a camping trip with her family. She made a couple of stops. Everybody was like, yeah, she was not intoxicated. And then she ended up driving 2 miles on a freeway and 2 miles wrong way on a freeway, sorry. And she hit another car and killed 8 people, and her son was the only survivor. And so, one of the really horrible things about this accident, unfortunately, was like the dad of the kids and the husband of Diane was super public about his belief that the toxicology report, which the police department produced, was not accurate. So basically, the gist was the police came out. They said Diane was super intoxicated, she was super drunk, that's what caused the crash, and her husband very, very publicly refuted it and then went on to make a documentary with HBO about it. So these are the letterbox reviews of it. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it, but basically people were like, this is shameful and exploitative, like it's pain mongering and it sucks. This is just like a very long example of this family being in denial, and it's really hard to see. And then also at the very end, the documentary featured the bodies actually in the accident scene of the crash. And a lot of people were like, those were all children. Let's not really do that, right? So this kind of brought up a really interesting point for me, and it's something that I'm thinking of fresh in my mind because of the Ocean Gate tragedy, where we have this thing where it's like we have experts and then we have experience in tragedy. And obviously, I think like everybody wants to be correct and everybody really wants to deal with tragedy in a way that feels like in line with their worldview, right? So when people hear about something bad happening, they're going to make assumptions about how that tragedy happened based on how they want it to happen and not necessarily based on how it did actually happen, right? So like we just don't like it when bad stuff happens. We want to find solutions for it, and scientific analysis is very unhuman. It's very boring, it's very long, it's just like a very like not emotionally cathartic process to necessarily go through, like especially if you lost a lot of kids or if you're like just dealing with this discordance like within your heart and within your mind. So one of the things that's quite interesting is like what are the ethics of projecting our experiences onto tragedy, especially like in online forums, right? Can you be like, well, you know, my cousin fell off his bicycle like 3 years ago because he took a Tylenol once. Like, what qualifies you necessarily to talk about a tragedy? So, something that's really like top of my mind is like James Cameron discussing OceanGate. Like, James Cameron is legend, icon, submarine boy. So like his discussion of OceanGate was actually quite interesting because in an interview he was like, I knew what happened and I didn't want to say it because it wasn't necessarily my place to say it. And I thought that that was a super interesting approach to it because literally everybody and their fucking grandmother was like, I'm a submarine expert. I applied for the Navy once. This submarine fell to like the bottom of the ocean and they're all pounding in there. And it was just like, it was just so interesting to me how the person who was probably the most knowledgeable about it was just like silent, which I think actually in hindsight was a really good thing. So there's that. And then it's also like the Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard thing. For me as a child of divorce, that just felt like everybody's like spousal divorce issues like being projected in this very hyper online, hyper like debate centric just like clusterfuck, for lack of a better word. Like it felt like if Ben Shapiro and Bernie Sanders debated like live streamed on Twitch and Truth Social and like every side was just trying to slam the other instead of trying to figure out the truth. And so kind of moving forward, we have like what does tragedy actually look like in our modern internet, right? Like we've only had social media around for like maybe 10 years, at least to me. I'm Gen Z. I was not on MySpace, so maybe I don't count that. But what I'm thinking of is like gore videos, right? Like tragedy is just trauma porn everywhere. Like, especially I'm thinking of the brick video, which like, don't look it up. You don't want to see it. But the gist of it was like, it's this dash cam footage and this guy is driving with his fiance and a brick falls out of a truck and kills his fiance, and the video is of him like looking at his fiance and realizing that she's dead. Like awful. And it's like it's basically considered to be like an accomplishment if you're able to watch that in these like trauma circles, right? So I'm thinking of that, and then I'm also thinking of how the news clip of that father who responded to the Uvalde shooting became this just like international like viral like phenomenon in its own way. And it was horrifying to watch that, like correctly horrifying, right? And so we have these just very emotionally charged moments of tragedy that are being like packaged into content and being put online. And I think something that we saw back more in like 2018, it's not necessarily a recent phenomenon that I know of, was like the translation of tragedy into activism. And like I was kind of part of youth activism. I know a lot of people who were in the gun violence space, but there was this very strong pipeline of people who went through school shootings turning into gun control advocates, right? And so that was super interesting because it was like a very uniquely internet phenomenon that I don't think otherwise we would have seen to the exact scale if we didn't have like social media in place, right? But I think on the other end, tragedy brings clout chasers, and what we're also seeing is a lot of these incel forums and in a lot of these like darker spaces, people are looking to create tragedy as a means of infamy and as a means of legend, right? So I think we kind of have like all of these pieces of tragedy that have kind of been moving forward, kind of standard, like you used to be, you read about it in the news and then you just kind of like discuss it with your family, and then that's like pretty much it. And so one of the things that I think is like super interesting from the Aunt Diane documentary to now is it really kind of predicted tragedy as a form of content for anybody to use. Like, to me, Something's Wrong with Aunt Diane was like a very weird documentary, and I was like, I watched it and I was like, it feels very wrong to be making content like about something that's really fucked up so many people's lives. And in hindsight, I was like, I've consumed a lot of true crime content, so what about this is making me more uncomfortable than a more abstracted version? Like, I used to love these like makeup and murder videos. I don't watch them anymore, kind of after thinking about it and realizing like it's not just a story that like someone is telling like on a podcast or someone's telling like while they're putting on makeup. It's like these people have actual relatives who exist online, who continue to look up content about this, who are just like forever digitally enshrined in like the worst moments of their life. And I really don't want to be part of consuming content that keeps people trapped in that, right? And then I also think like grief on a human level just makes tragedy on social media so much more potent, right? Like, people want to feel connected. They want to feel like there's other people who are going to be there for them in times of distress. And I also feel like there's a level of disbelief to grief where in our day-to-day lives, we kind of live in this like, not protected, but we live kind of like in a bubble mailer. And I feel like tragedy is one of those things where it really obviously shakes everybody out of our illusions of day-to-day safety, and it really shakes everybody out of our just like relentless feelings of monotony and like everything's gonna be chill. And so I feel like because it's just so disruptive from our day-to-day lives, we really seek out tragedy as a way to stop it from happening again, and we try to learn about it. Especially like women are huge into true crime, and women also are a lot of the victims of crime, right? And so we kind of have this like very interesting dynamic that's always been present around tragedy that's now like put online for everybody to comment, everybody to see, for it to basically like live on forever. And so one of the things that I don't know and that I'm really interested in finding out is like, what is the correct way to discuss tragedy while holding space for victims and giving them time for grief, right? And I also think something that we've more recently seen is a lot of this online tragedy in the context of political movements, where it's like watching police brutality videos or watching school shootings like happen and unfurl online in real time. And so there are some tragedies where it's not just like someone drove the wrong way on the freeway, but it's results of systemically unfair policy. It's the results of like political decisions, and they are inherently political death. And so in that case, it's like, does the political context of tragedy add more or less boundaries to it? Like, is it okay to make fun of a car crash? Obviously not. Is it okay to make fun of a school shooting? Some people on Twitter probably think so, right? So it's like, does the political context of these deaths change how we interact with it online, or should it? And then in that case, who really gets to determine the political direction of a tragedy, right? So when March for Our Lives happened after the Parkland shooting, you had a very strong group of people who went for the gun control movement, but there was also one guy, I don't remember his name, I'm sorry, but he went very like far right. So then it kind of begged the question of like, you always have these talking points of don't politicize a tragedy right after it happens. But then there kind of brings into the question, who gets to determine what is politicized and who gets to determine the direction of that politicization, right? So there's that. But I think ultimately what it comes down to, and what I think we should be very realistic about when we discuss the ethics of tragedy online, is that tragedy brings money, right? Emotions and making money online are primarily driven by extremes. Like when you see clickbait, it's not like, oh, I feel kind of mid about, you know, the fact that this lady like smushed 7 bananas on her face and then got rid of all the wrinkles, right? Like tragedy brings clicks, and clicks bring ad revenue, and ad revenue and engagement is money. So I feel like when we discuss all of these things, we need to keep in mind, like, tech companies are making money off of tragedies and off of school shootings. Like news businesses are like making money off of it, right? So I think there's just this very interesting kind of like interesting lens of what does tragedy look like through the lens of like tech enablization, right? And I think number one, it brings obviously clout chasers and infamy to a lot of these very dark online spaces in a way that we haven't really seen, like especially with copycat school shooters and stuff like that. And I also think, and this is to me, but like communities surrounding perpetrators, I'm not here for it. Like the accounts where it's like, oh, like Jeffrey Dahmer's my bae, or like people getting tattoos of like instruments used in crime. Like I think that stuff is like, obviously it's not limited to our time period because people like wrote letters and like love letters to serial killers like while they were in jail before, but I think it adds a new level of digital preservation to a lot of the stuff that otherwise wouldn't get preserved, right? Like let's say a school shooting happens and then someone looks it up like 10 years later and they now find all of these like accounts of the school shooter that are like, oh my gosh, I love like Mr. XYZ, right? Like it adds a new layer, and I think it also creates a very dangerous playbook for people who want to get attention and they want to send a message and they know that they can just do XYZ in order to get it. Like I think that's quite dangerous. And then I also think like the wider accessibility and the hyper cycles that social media just uses just take tragedy to an entirely new level, right? Like I think with OceanGate and with like all of these school shootings, it's become very dialed in where it's like you don't just hear about it after it's happened. You hear about it the first time, you hear ongoing updates, you get like accounts being created, you get like memes happening, you get experts weighing in who are like maybe credible, maybe not. You just get like random people being like, well, my uncle was on a narco sub once. Like there's just like so many different ways that like normal people can interact with and be a part of tragedy in a way that wasn't possible like on MySpace in 2005, right? So I think that's something also to take into consideration is like we have a lot of these like hyper information cycles on social media that we otherwise normally wouldn't. And so the way that we react to tragedy and the way that we parse tragedy is so much more different, right? Like we're not like, oh, this happened and that was awful. It's like we feel like we're a part of it. We're like, oh my gosh, this shooting happened. My cousin lives in Minnesota. That's really scary. And then you get like all of the updates and then you get all of the victims' names and then you get to really follow along and be there on every step of the process. And I don't know if that's something that's healthy, right? And then there's the other flip side of it where it's like tragedy is a content opportunity now, right? Where it's like people make true crime podcasts, they make videos, like I'm even talking about it, right? Like this is a content opportunity for me and my hands aren't clean, right? So I think there's also this kind of question of like, okay, tragedy is something that is very, very deeply destabilizing in these people's lives, and we're taking these people's like absolute worst nightmares and moments and the things that have probably like broken their idea of a just world, and we're like making podcast episodes about it. Like, is that okay? I don't know. And then there's also the narratives of tragedy like within social media bubbles where everybody's gonna have a different opinion on it, right? So I think the one that stands out most to me is like school shootings, and it's like a school shooting happens, you go on right-wing Twitter, it's very much like mental health and like we need to fund more mental health programs and like we need to get more people guns, and then you go on leftist Twitter and it's like all guns need to be taken away, like we have to have safe housing, we have to kind of like deal with the incel problem. Like it just creates these very like multi-directional narratives of tragedy where you can basically kind of like pick and choose your opinion on it, right? It's not kind of like you read a news article and you're able to form your own opinion. It's like, oh, these political opinions and these thoughts have already been formed around it. So this is what I came across also when I was doing research like about the Taconic Parkway crash, about social media. Like this first account, they just like straight up posted the car crash like as like romanticization, as like object of fascination. Obviously I blocked it because like the more I think about it, the more I feel deeply uncomfortable seeing photographs of an accident where 8 people were killed. And also like using that for like podcast promotion, right? Like, is that okay? Who gets to decide when that's okay? Because obviously, like, this person made a tweet that really resonated with me and that made me think a lot about how we use tragedy and when tragedy is appropriate as content, where they basically said, I'll never forgive the person who recorded my dad's accident and put it on YouTube. Stop recording people's last moments and putting it online. These people have families. And then also this one, which made me so sad. My grandma was hit and killed by a FedEx truck as a pedestrian, and the local news had footage of her body in the street and her crushed walker on the news as just another story. My literal best friend, I will never forget that. I did not want to visualize. So I think like the biggest ethical thing to me is like there's a bunch of public and private interlines of tragedy. And obviously tragedy is something that really emotionally grabs us all. But I think who gets to define the narrative of tragedy and who gets to define like when it's being shared, when it's being turned into content is really something that we don't have a lot of internet etiquette on. And I feel like the conversations that we've been starting to have about true crime are good for this reason, where it's kind of like we're starting to establish boundaries and we're starting to be like, hey guys, that's kind of weird. But I also feel like we haven't like deliberated on this enough. So like something that I'm thinking about is like, as a Bring Me the Horizon fan, Ollie Sykes and the cheating scandal with his girlfriend, who is a public figure and a tattoo artist, and basically they had like this giant social media blow up, and he wrote a couple of songs on their album Ammo that were just very revealing about the details of their relationship. And I think it's kind of like, it plays into this interesting question of like, okay, tragedies around public figures and around private figures. Like, is tragedy around public figures more okay to make fun of and more okay to talk about because they were more accessible within the public, or is it like worse, right? Because they didn't really get to have their own sense of humanity and their own sense of self, and like even in death and even in their tragedy they still don't get to have that. Also like who owns the grief surrounding that situation, and like so let's say I get hit by a bus tomorrow. Like, obviously, my boyfriend is allowed to grieve that on Twitter, but like, what about the person who I met like 10 years ago, like in middle school? Are they allowed to post like, oh, I knew her in middle school, this is so sad? Like, who gets to own grief? And then also, like, what do we owe these grieving families whose nightmares are being like digitally forever preserved? So, like, for me, I'm not gonna get into it, but like, if you ever Google me or if you've seen my face before, like I was a mental health advocate and I very publicly struggled a lot with suicidal ideation and a lot with suicide attempts. And that information was made public about me by reporters when I didn't really understand what was going on and I didn't really consent. I was foolish and I was like 15 and I was like talking about it, but I didn't necessarily know that it would like turn into headlines that would follow me forever. And so I kind of have a deep and profound sympathy for these families because it's like something that is a very, very small but horrible moment in their lives has been turned into content creation for revenue generation, and it's just like forever there. Like they can't message CNN and be like, hey, can you take down this article like about my mom dying? Like it's just generally accepted that it's part of the public history or a part of like public knowledge now, and they just forever have to live with that. So like, what do we owe them? Like obviously they're going through something very like hard and very personal. Like, are we allowed to like make memes about it? Should we have like a mandatory like grieving holding period, or is it just like free reign, right? So I think that also kind of brings into question of like, okay, like what we owe these grieving families is really about like us, right? Because like I feel like for me, I don't need to know about all these school shootings. Like I don't need to know about like the latest explosion or the latest thing going on. And I feel like when I do consume tragedy, like which I do, I don't want to give off the impression that like I'm looking down on people. Like I'm very into like mechanical tragedy, like airplane fatalities, like maritime disasters. Like I'm not like, my hands are not clean here, but I try to focus on tragedies that have been the result of like mechanical failure or the result of systemic like oversight or failure or regulation failure, not of like individual people or of like individual policies. And so for me, I try to kind of frame it as like I'm just going in to learn about it like for my nonprofit and so that I can figure out how to be a better leader. And I try to not consume it as a way to calm my anxieties and a way to figure out, okay, like what do I not have to do so I don't have to get stabbed, right? So I think there is this question of like, should we be allowed to use private tragedy for personal comfort? Or should we be even allowed to use like public tragedy? And like, when is that line crossed from like public to private? Is it like through basically like the irregularity of the event? Like, right? Like if someone dies from a freak accident, does that make it public lexicon because it's so rare? Or is it like impact? Is it the amount of people who've been hurt? Is it the people who were involved in the accident, right? Like, is it the novelty of the technology, like with OceanGate, where they were literally just trying out like this brand new submarine? And so I also think like all of these things being said, like we can talk about like these ethical issues forever. I do want to root this like discussion in these ethical like woohoo questions have real repercussions on families that do follow them around. And I feel like we can talk about like what's ethical as long as we want, but I feel like we should discuss like, okay, like what does it actually do? Like imagine if you're Diane's like aunt who had kids die in the crash and like every time you Google your sister, it's just how she murdered all your kids. Like that fucking sucks. Like you're just like permanently digitally attached to something and it just lives on outside of you and you have no control over it, and it's just linked to your family name, and you can like get trapped in the cycle of you're just like stuck in your grief, or you're forever related to your grief, or tragedy is all what people know of you and it's how they first judge you. And then there's also the question of like you are more publicized in a sense, and like there's a lot of stories about psychics who reach out to parents of missing kids and who say, I know where your kids are, who are kind of like looking for fame and looking for infamy. And so it also begs the question of like, when the tragedy is publicized, it brings along people who are motivated by financial means, right? So my question is like, should the Parkway tragedy have even been a documentary? Like, was that even cool of HBO to make? Like, that's a question I don't know. But I did want to kind of like center it back onto the Aunt Diane documentary and discuss like what the repercussions are, where it's like there was another car involved and the family of people who were in that car were interviewed and they were basically like, yeah, Diane was intoxicated. Like, we don't want to hear the rumors that she wasn't because our family has died as a result of her actions and we really like don't want to deal with it. Right? And then Diane's sister doesn't want to be involved with it. She lost her kids. And then I think like the gist of it is the worst moments of these people's lives and their wife that they knew for like decades and their nieces and their sisters, like all of this family just had this horrible tragedy happen to them, and now it's like a movie on a streaming service. And like, not that HBO is like alone in this, like it's on Netflix and it's on Hulu, and it's like this entire kind of like genre of tragedy as documentary so that we can consume content, so that we understand how to not do that. Like, I don't know, that's just hard for me to digest. And then also like, does art ever justify extending and encoding the suffering of other people? Like in the case of the documentary makers, like they kind of enabled the husband of Diane and the father of some of the kids who died in the crash to give them a platform to really say like, I don't think this is what my wife did, even against the opinion of experts who were very scientifically backed up, right? So does their wanting to make that documentary, or does someone's like wanting to make a meme and be funny and like gain cultural clout like justify the creation of content based on tragedy? Like, I don't know. Like, I think art in a way should provide something of value, and it should provide something of just like general emotion. But like, is there anything that's off limit for art? Or is art just like always acceptable no matter what, no matter the repercussions, and no matter who it hurts, right? And then I also think it brings up an interesting question of like, who gets to decide the public narrative of a tragedy, and like what's accepted, and like what is the official like consensus on it, right? Like, I feel like a lot of people in hindsight are going to be like, well, that Ocean Gate guy hated public, like hated hated like legislation, hated regulation, hated safety, and so therefore the public narrative is that he's a dumbass, and like we all get to like publicly thumbs down and clown on him, right? And so I think like the public narrative and also like the private narrative of the families is something that like we should maybe consider, and we should think about like as we're actively consuming tragedy. And so I think for me, like my biggest question going into it is like, what is the etiquette around dealing with tragedy online? Like, is there ever a responsible way to deal with tragedy? Like, is it always harmful? And I think like I don't know everything, and I think like the bare minimum is like, don't approach family with theories and don't try to make money off of them. Like, remember humans behind the content and try to figure out like, is the humor ever justified, right? Like, I remember reading this Reddit post of this dad who had a son die in a horrific way, and then he found out his other son was making TikTok content about it, and it was going viral, and the dad was just like basically traumatized and heartbroken. And I think it kind of brings up this important thing of like, humor is a way that some people cope, but it's definitely not funny to other people, right? So there's that. And then also like, don't expect people who've suffered to carry the burden of stopping the tragedy again. Like, this is more so in relation to political movements and in relation to political organizing. And I think like what we're starting to see around like tragedy and like content, and especially around like the politicization, there we go, I can speak, of like these very pressing systemic issues online, is like, we're like, okay, school shooting happens, all school shooting survivors, go save the world. Like, climate change is happening, okay, young kids, like, get up on stage and talk about it, right? Like, Black people, one of you got shot, okay, now like convince us. Like, it's not the responsibility of people who are affected by tragedy to stop that tragedy from happening again. And I think that's a very dangerous expectation to place on someone whose like existence is changed, you know? So that's my own personal feelings. And I also want to say like, your own values and how you would handle the situation is not an indication of how you should handle the situation, right? Like, if I were to get hit by a car, I'm very anti-car. I would tell my boyfriend, you should politicize this, like, get all cars off the road, like, everybody needs to use train. But also, if someone else's kid got hit by a car, I'm not gonna be like, okay, like, bing bing bing, like, anti-car agenda, like, all over it, directly on like the grieving parents like Facebook page, right? And so I feel like there also needs to be an understanding of like, just because you would like your own tragedy handled in a manner doesn't mean that you should handle the tragedy that way for other people. Then I also think like, let experts do their job. Everybody just like, let experts do their job and figure it out, and stop being a backseat forensic investigator, because it just leads to more information. It leads to people freaking out, and kind of like what I already said, where like your experience is not always going to overshadow expertise, and I feel like we shouldn't like keep on conflating these things. And then also like, this is something that's more long term, but I feel like we should let people live on beyond their grief, and like stop just automatically assuming that like they are the worst thing in their life that they've been through, right? Like, I'm thinking about Monica Lewinsky right now, and how she was just like constantly defined by this like scandal with Bill Clinton, and how it was like a very small amount of time in her 20s, and now it's just become her like the reason why everybody knows her. And I think it's safe to say like, even if that's the only reason why you know somebody, that doesn't necessarily mean that like, because that information is public, that it's okay for you to talk about it to them. That doesn't necessarily mean that like, because this has happened, that they want to discuss it, that they feel comfortable bringing it up, that they feel comfortable like commenting on the situation. Like, I feel that people should be able to live beyond their grief, and for it to not be like news and for it to not be forever associated with them. Like, in the time that I was researching this, Diane's sister, who lost a few kids in the accident, was pregnant again with another child, like, after the accident. And one of the headlines that kept on coming up on Twitter was like, oh, like, this lady who lost a lot of kids in the accident, she has another kid, right? And my question is, like, why are we still framing her within the context of the worst few moments of her life? Like, I'm glad that happened for her, but honestly, I feel like that should have not been reported on. That was not cool. She should not be always known forever as the person who lost kids in a devastating accident with her sister. And I feel like the fact that she got pregnant again is her kind of like proof of that, right? So let people live beyond their grief. Don't hold them to it. And then for me, kind of like, these are the questions that I'm opening to share and to comment on. These are questions that I still don't know, that I'm trying to figure it out. But it's like, when does a tragedy leave the realm of like a local, small, like freak accident to a worldwide one, right? Like, is it ever justified for these like small crashes or for these small like incidents to be thrown into like a worldwide like debate? And then also, like, is it ever okay to share photos or videos in the aftermath of a tragedy? And this one is a little bit more clear cut for me because I think the answer is not, unless it's for the purposes of figuring it out. But I still don't think that it should ever be shared on social media. I don't feel like it should ever be used as promotional materials. I don't feel like it really should be public except for the forensic investigators and the agencies that are dealing with the case. And I just don't feel like, even if it means nothing to us, like, I just don't feel like those images that really are emotionally charged for specific people should ever be shared as content to make money. Like, that's really what it comes down to. So thank you for letting me ramble about this crazy HBO documentary. I watched it a couple of months ago. It's been stuck in my mind ever since. And the Ocean Gate tragedy, like, last month really has just, like, refreshed this in my brain. So I wanted to end the video on serotonin because a lot of the topics that we're going to discuss are super hard and they're not very fun to discuss. And so I just kind of want to like set the space to like reset and laugh so that it's not just like a very depressing emotional clusterfuck. So there's the cat next to a loaf of bread. There's a betta fish. And then these are my favorite memes of the week. I'm going to exit my face so you can see it, but this one's relatable, this one's relatable, this one's also relatable, and that's it. So